Full frame versus crop sensors. This has been the debate for the longest time. If you're doing genres of photography such as outdoor portraits or nighttime photography, then the differences could be quite noticeable for you. But if you're doing other genres such as landscapes or architecture, perhaps this is not such a big deal. So, when it comes to wildlife photography, how do these two types of sensors compare? I've personally used a crop sensor camera for a good number of years before I got a full-frame camera. But even so, I'm still keeping my crop sensor camera. Being a semi-professional wildlife photographer that is still using a full-frame and a crop sensor camera for my works, let me now weigh the pros and cons of each type of sensor for wildlife photography. The first thing is going to be weight and size. Crop sensor cameras in general are going to be lighter and smaller than their full-frame counterparts, which are heavier and bigger. There are of course exceptions to this rule. This is certainly a factor to consider if you are carrying a lot of equipment and also doing a lot of hiking. So weight savings is something that you are looking out for. At the same time, crop sensor cameras also offer smaller and lighter lenses for the same reach that you want to get with a full-frame camera. For instance, if you want a full-frame equivalent reach of 450mm, then you would only need to get a 300mm lens for your crop sensor camera. So with regards to the camera body and the camera lens, going the crop sensor route definitely will result in better weight savings. In my experience, I found that this is not such a big issue for me because I find myself fit enough to carry heavier loads. But if you're someone that finds that this is something that's essential for you to be able to cut back on the weight and size, then definitely going the crop sensor route makes more sense. The next thing we're going to talk about is reach. For the same lens, the crop sensor camera can offer 1.5 times more reach than the full-frame camera does. And definitely 1.5 times can be crucial for wildlife photography, especially if you're trying to reach in further on your subject. But then again begs the question, is reach really everything in wildlife photography? Perhaps if you're doing bird photography, it could be something important because birds are generally small and you can't get too close to them. But perhaps in other genres like mammals and reptile photography, perhaps reach is not such a big issue after all. For me personally, I like to get as close to my subject as possible. So in my personal opinion, I think if you can get closer to your subject, then perhaps reach doesn't matter as much. Next up, let's talk about depth of field. For the same reach, standing from the same position, the depth of field from a full-frame camera is going to be shallower than that of a crop sensor camera. For instance, if you're trying to get a photograph of an animal at 450mm on a full-frame camera, then you'd only need a 300mm lens on a crop sensor camera. But with all the settings being equivalent, the depth of field from the full-frame camera is going to be shallower, aka your background is going to be more blur. So then begs the question, is shallow depth of field always necessary? I do find myself quite often stopping down the aperture in order to get more of the animal in focus. So for instance, if you're very close to a particular subject, an animal, for instance a bird, you may find that at the widest aperture value, the head of the animal might be in focus, whereas the tail is out of focus, which is not something that we might want. And you must remember that at longer focal lengths, your background will be naturally blurred anyway, even if your aperture is at f8 or f11. If you do subgenres of wildlife photography like macro photography, where you constantly find yourself requiring to shoot at f11 or f13 or doing focus stacking, then definitely the advantages of a crop sensor camera is there because it gives a deeper depth of field. I find that the depth of field issue isn't that big a deal for me because whatever size sensor camera I choose to use, I'm always trying to find the best position for me to stand at such that the background is as far away from the subject as possible. And I think this is a skill that trumps the advantage that full-frame cameras have in giving you more out-of-focus backgrounds. Then, of course, we have to talk about price. Generally speaking, crop sensor cameras tend to be cheaper than their full-frame counterparts, although not necessarily always true. But in general, for the same budget, you can either get an older full-frame camera or a newer crop sensor camera with better autofocus performance and features. So no matter what people say, for price, I'd always give the win to the crop sensor camera. Then we talk about lens options. With crop sensor cameras, you can either mount crop sensor lenses or full-frame lenses onto them, whereas for full-frame cameras, you can only mount full-frame lenses onto them. which makes crop sensor cameras a lot more versatile. In the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's such a big issue, but definitely a small win for the crop sensor cameras. Another thing we have to discuss will be the high ISO performance. Now, full-frame cameras tend to have better high ISO performance because their larger sensors allow more light to come in. In many instances for wildlife photography, you're only shooting when the light levels are low, for instance at sunrise, sunset, or even at night for nocturnal photography. So definitely a good high ISO performance will result in cleaner images. But these days, with AI coming out in post-processing softwares that help you significantly with denoising, I don't think this really matters so much anymore. My personal opinion is that if you find yourself shooting in open areas a lot, for instance grasslands, savannas, lakes, then honestly a crop sensor camera is okay because you are generally shooting at lower ISOs anyway. But if you find yourself doing a lot of nocturnal photography without the use of flash, or if you're shooting in, for instance, jungle where the light levels are always naturally low, then I think a full-frame camera will be definitely advantageous here. The last thing that I want to talk about is dynamic range. Now, there's no question about it. You can find this information online that full-frame definitely wins over crop sensor cameras almost all the time. But I don't think that dynamic range really plays such a big role in wildlife photography. If you do landscape photography, for instance, then yes, sure, dynamic range is something definitely important to consider. But for wildlife photography, I find that most of the time you don't need to be pushing and pulling and recovering highlights and shadow details all that much. So really, dynamic range is not such a big deal after all. So what would be my conclusion? Honestly, if I had a fixed budget, I would go for a crop sensor camera paired with a full frame lens, and eventually if I decide that I want to invest more into this hobby down the line, then I might upgrade to a full frame camera in the future. But you must remember that lots of the greatest images out there for wildlife photography have been taken with a crop sensor camera, and this is a genre of photography where really crop sensor cameras shine just as much as their full frame counterparts. But at the end of the day, this is something that's ultimately your decision, whichever you want to pick. But just note that there are pros and cons to either one, and I can't really recommend one over the other without knowing exactly what you need.